Welcome to Insights into Success. We're with your host Paul Dodds. We hope to educate, inspire and motivate you to achieve your own personal success. We talk to guests from all around the world from a variety of walks of life to hear the realities of their own journey to success. What challenges have they faced? How have they coped with failure? And what have been the keys or will be the keys to their own success? In our Read to Succeed interviews, we talk books that have inspired our guests, and for some, they share their secrets to marketing success. Join us as we give you insights into success. All right, Jonathan, well, welcome to Insights into Success. Thank you for agreeing to come on board today. I'm really interested to talk to you because I know that you've got a bit of a story to tell me, and I don't know exactly what it is. I just kind of have a bit of a flavour for it, I guess. But before we get down to that, what I would like to do is just start off by inviting you just to kind of tell us who you are and what your current job is right now and what that actually entails.
Sure. So first of all, thanks for having me on the show, Paul. It's great to have the opportunity to speak a little bit about what I do. So my name is Jonathan Jansen, or in the virtual realm, it's probably known as Arcadian more frequently. And I am the first CEO for the New Zealand Esports Federation. So in 2020, esports was recognized as a sport by Sport New Zealand. We're now the NSO, the National Sporting Organization. And it's my job to really help drive the ecosystem and make esports recognized and really push it into that tier one sport category, recognized throughout New Zealand and drive the benefits for all Kiwis in terms of what sporting can deliver through esports as a medium. And so that's really my driver. Super excited about the position. And I'm about 6 weeks into the job right now, so it's been really exciting the last couple of weeks getting on board.
And I imagine it's going to be a bit of a challenge for you because you're going to have to break down a lot of barriers because I'm guessing that there's probably a lot of preconceived ideas about esports. So how do you think you're going to combat that?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think you're right. There is these preconceived ideas or this almost a perceived negative stigma around gaming and esports. But I don't think it's actually the reality of the situation. So recently, the DNZ 2022 report came out, which was a report around gaming done as a research report by Bond University over in Australia. And they surveyed a whole lot of New Zealanders, and they found that gaming is, so to give you some context, in 2015, we had about 400,000 gamers in New Zealand, right, which is a pretty significant number. From 2021, that's grown from 400,000 to 1.6 million.
Wow.
And so it's exploding in the space. Yeah, and I mean, if you in your head have the idea of, if you can visualize what you imagine that negative stigma stereotypical gamer to be, right? You can see that image in your head. And then if I was to tell you that, hey, based on the demographics, 49% of gamers in New Zealand are female.
Oh,
the
really?
the largest growing age demographic is 60 plus.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, and so
me away with those two stats. It's incredible.
Yeah, it is. So I think the reality is there's this idea that we get in our head when we talk about gaming, but it is a really archaic one, and it's not relevant or the reality of what it is today. The fact of the matter is, I think over the lockdown that we've just had, 77% of parents played games with their children as a way to build connection and bond with them. Right. And so it really is becoming a normal thing that Kiwis are engaging with across the board as a way to help develop their relationships, which was the number one reason that people are being engaged with gaming and esports. And so there is a negative stigma around it. I think the crux to it, though, is just really helping people understand what it really is compared to what they might think it is. And so it's just the education piece for me.
And tell me, though, what's the difference between gaming and esports? Because I understand there is a bit of a difference.
Yeah, it's complicated for us for many reasons. But, in a nutshell, gaming is the traditional sport equivalent of going down to the beach with your mates and throwing around a rugby ball. You're doing it for the social, for the recreation. It's just a good time, but you wouldn't exactly call yourself a rugby player if you were just at the beach throwing a rugby ball around. Right. Esports is the equivalent to showing up to the match at 9 a.m. on a Sunday in the rain, and you're doing it for your teammates. And you're practicing that discipline and that sportsmanship. Specifically, it's organized gaming. And so it's that structure that we put behind it, and really take it to that next level. And the reason that there is that definitive difference is because there's a few things that sport gives us in terms of benefits. And we know that New Zealand or Kiwi sportsmen and women globally have that real recognition for being really humble, gracious, great sportsmanship, and all of those core values reflect into your real life or your personal life.
Right.
And those are the same values that you get through esports, but not necessarily just gaming as a recreation. So it's a little bit of the recreation versus the organized aspect.
So is it a bit like other traditional sports where if you go into the formal structure of esports, there's really kind of like a code of conduct. There's an expectation on behavior that is imposed on people, so that in competing, everyone competes as good, fair-minded sports people.
There should be. At the moment, there's not exactly.
Right.
I think that, but absolutely, that's the way it should be. One of our core values as part of the NZESF that we've been defining over the last few months has been integrity as really a pillar of what we do. And I think it is important. And this isn't something unique to esports, but when I said that we have a couple of unique challenges in esports, is that across all sports, traditional sports, whether it be netball, rugby, hockey, volleyball, whatever it is, all of these different experiences that you have teach you about sportsmanship or good training practices or physical health. Whereas because esports is in the digital world, there are all these digital world specific principles that we have to educate people on that no other sport has to take responsibility for. And one of those things is things like integrity. There's a massive psychological difference between competing with someone face to face versus competing with them through a computer. And sometimes removing that personal element can really help people be more toxic or unsportsmanlike. And so it's really our responsibility to help teach our younger generations and even our current sports people around how they can act with integrity online, because it is much easier to sledge someone through a computer screen and maybe go beyond that limit that's acceptable because you're online and you don't recognize there's someone on the other side of the screen, whereas in person you do have that much more personal emotive connection. And so that's one of the unique challenges that we face. It's something that we definitely want to drive. I think I have to be honest and say I don't think esports in general is there just yet. At a very top professional level, it's absolutely, it's expected. There's codes of conduct, there's behavioral requirements, and even players who go and play recreationally and don't show good sportsmanlike behavior can be barred from competing at competitive events. And so there is a structure there, but we just need to make sure that it's ingrained all the way through, because I think the way that we treat people online is something really, really important that I think generally we don't get enough education on.
Yeah, and look, as a parent, I've observed my sons on playing games and gaming rather than esports. And one of the concerns I have is the behavior and some of the language and the communication. And as you say, it's like the people on the other end, because you're not close to them, you're not physically seeing them, there's not the same appreciation problem probably that they have feelings too. They're human beings too, and you can hurt them and you can bully them, etc. So I guess for me, that's always been a concern as a parent, is that element to gaming.
Yeah, and I think that's not unique to gaming, though. I think that exists as one of those digital world challenges. And whether or not you're a gamer, if you use social media, you see the types of comments people can put on Facebook or Instagram or wherever it is, and it's just because you remove that personal element. And so it is something that we need to be educated on, not specific to gaming, but just in a digital space. Just by the way that we interact in a digital space, I sort of personally take that as part of our responsibility. But it can be as simple a solution as just letting people know, hey, there is someone on the other end of that screen. And something that simple can help put the dots together for the new generation who have kind of lived in a digital world and they've grown up with touchscreen devices and everything else. Sometimes that small piece of connection just isn't there yet. And so it's not a big task. It's just a really important one we have to do diligently.
Now, you mentioned before that people might recognize you by another name. I wonder if you might just tell me a little bit about that name and the significance of it, and what your specialty has been.
Yeah, sure. So my history in the Arcadian is what I'm known as online. In the esports space, or when I'm playing games, it's usually my what we call refer to as a gamer tag. It's a way that I can sort of express myself online without obviously putting out my real identity on the internet because of the risks associated with that.
Right.
My background is in League of Legends, so I've been a lifelong gamer my entire life, and this is one of the reasons I'm so excited about this position is because I'm incredibly passionate about it. I probably started gaming when I was 4 or 5 years old. So I
Wow.
remember one of my earliest memories was my older brother. He's 10 years my senior, and he got a PC one day, and he installed Red Alert on it, and Duke Nukem and some of the real old school games. And
Yeah.
he set it up and he'd play those all day, and I'd sit behind him and just watch in like amazement. And so from about 4 or 5 years old, I started venturing onto the computer when he wasn't looking and clicking around and sort of opening up the Microsoft games, and sort of playing some of those sorts of games. My mother was fortunate enough; she bought me this toy laptop that was really just a toy at the time that had a couple of learning games on it that I used to
Right.
love just playing with it, and that kind of sparked, I guess, my passion for gaming. And then by the time I was around 10 or 11 years old, I started playing a game called RuneScape, which is basically a fantasy world game. You can, mine rocks and cut down trees and build things and all those sorts of things. So it was like a fantasy world. And as a 10-year-old, I really didn't know it at the time, but you learn so much you just absorb so much information in this game. Like I learned about the different types of wood and the different types of rocks and how those chemistry reactions in the rocks can create, you smelt them together to make bars. And there's all these
Wow.
interesting
Okay.
things you just don't really realize at the time. But I really enjoyed that game, and I became fully encompassed with it. And that actually led me into developing games. And so I wanted to extend beyond the game and learn how I could make my own versions of this or edit my character and tweak things. And it got me into software development. And that's where I sort of first coined my name online, which was Arcadian. And so wherever I go in the online space, that's kind of my preferred game name. Got into League of Legends as I was a little bit older, and got pretty good at that. I was one of the top players in the Oceanic region as it started out, and so
Wow.
then I ended up getting into YouTube and making YouTube videos, sort of tutorials of how to play the game better and how to just some funny observational comedy, I guess, on the game itself. And that's kind of how I started getting known as Arcadian.
Right. Well, I mean, I think at this point I want to take you back actually, because I want to know a little bit more about your upbringing and kind of work forward in a little bit more detail, and and hear a little bit more about what you've been doing prior to this, because I think you've got a bit of a story there to tell me. But for a start, where were you born?
So I was born up in Kawakoa, up in the Bay of Islands. So that's
Right.
where I started my journey. Yeah, beautiful place. I was the youngest of four kids to my mother, but we had a sort of extended family that was much larger. So I was the youngest of the four direct siblings. By 5 years was my next sister. So there's quite a big gap between me and my younger sister. And then the other three siblings were quite close in age. And so I think that kind of contributed to my interest in gaming, because I kind of had to keep myself entertained while they occupied
Right.
themselves. I was always too young to participate in a lot of the things that they were doing.
Yeah.
So started in Kawakoa. We moved around quite a lot when I was younger. So we then went down to Cambridge for a couple of years. That's where I started my first year in primary school. And then we moved down to Lochinvar Station in Taupo, which was a very interesting experience, going to a
Wow.
school with 30 kids in the entire school at Rangataiki Independent School.
Wow, that would have been interesting.
Yeah, so and I really enjoyed the experience, living on the farm and having lambs and just, a little bit of a simpler way of life. And as a young boy, it was I really appreciate the experience. I have some really fond memories of the farm. Before finally we moved over to Ohope in Whakatane, and that was where I spent most of my childhood. And so on Ohope Beach, if you haven't been,
Yeah.
beautiful, beautiful
Yeah.
beach. So I was really lucky to grow up in that environment and go to Trident High School. My siblings all left home relatively early. So my sister left home at 16, And so I was sort of home by myself from the age of 11 years old. Mum was a single mother our entire life. She was a nurse.
Wow.
And so she was working shift work. I was at school. So I did almost grow up alone a lot of the time, which is where gaming and the computers really helped me, keep those social connections.
And how did you find it not having a dad? To what extent do you think that impacted on you growing up?
So honestly, not a whole lot. I'm hesitant to say that. So my parental situation was a little bit strange, I guess. So when I was growing up, I was always under the assumption, I guess, whether of my fault or not, that my older brothers and sisters and I shared the same dad. And so
Right.
the schedule was that basically during every school holidays or second school holidays, we'd go up and stay with my dad in the Bay of Islands. And he wasn't a mystery figure in our lives at all. A fantastic, father figure. When we did get to see him, just the reality of the world that we lived in, I guess. And it wasn't strange to us in the slightest. It was just like, hey, cool, school holidays, go get to hang out with dad, fun times. It wasn't until I was a little bit older, and I remember my mother taking me down to the park when I was about 10 or 11 years old. And she sat me down and said, hey, do you remember this friend of ours, this family friend that we used to have? And I was like, yeah, I do. When I was a little bit younger, I remember him being around. And she's like, do you remember what you used to call him? And I had no idea. I was just like, no, like what's, and she's like, well, you used to call him dad. And it actually turns out that my biological father, I never really actually knew very well. And I had a different biological father than the rest of my brothers and siblings.
Right.
And so I never truly knew my father, but I knew my dad. I consider the guy who took us in during the school holidays and advocated for us to be sort of my dad. And so I don't feel like I missed out on anything. I don't feel like it really impacted me too much. My oldest brother was quite 10 years my senior, so I didn't get to spend a lot of time with him growing up. But so I spent time in a household with a mother and two sisters. So I got a really interesting female perspective on life.
And how's that been for you? How's that worked out? Has that been good for you or not?
I think in my earlier years probably not, but growing up I have gained some more perspective. Like I'm really looking forward to. I don't have any kids at the moment, but I'm really looking forward to being a father and I guess giving more opportunity to my kids in that fatherly figure way and having that male perspective. I think that my family did a fantastic job with what they had, the situation that they were in. Like, we're not a wealthy family. We didn't have very much. We were wearing homemade clothes until I was 5 years old, kind of thing. And so I think that it gave me a really valuable perspective, but it's also something that I want to give more to for our kids. And so I don't think it affected me negatively.
And for you, it sounds like for quite a period of time, it was really almost like being an only child, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so my mum worked shift work a lot of the time, and this is probably what got me into a little bit of trouble at school. was that she'd either work shift work, so she'd either work during the day, which is kind of 7 till 3, or she'd work afternoon shift, which is kind of 2 p.m. until 11 p.m. So the two types of scenarios for me was that she'd leave before I had to go to school, and she'd come home after I was meant to be home. So I figured out one day that I could probably just not go to school and no one would be any the wiser. And that's when I was like, great, I can get really far ahead of my game and I can play my games and do all my stuff and I don't have to worry about school. And that was the reality of life for me for a little while. The other situation was if she was on afternoon shifts, she was working from 2 p.m. till 11, in which case I'd come home from school and have to, cook my own dinner, entertain myself for a few hours, put myself to bed, and so it was a lonely time in one aspect, but I actually really valued that time that I had because as an individual, I feel like it developed my independence significantly into a way that I had a perspective, and I don't want to use the word maturity, but I did have a really different perspective on life than a lot of kids my age. And I think that independence gave me sort of a confidence to apply critical and creative thinking to different situations that was invaluable to me growing up through school. I never struggled in an academic sense purely because I was able to kind of take that step out of childhood and reflect on the system as a whole and understand, what was important and what wasn't. And
Right.
I really attribute that down to the fact that I had that almost lost boys freedom as a kid.
And so for you, so by this stage, you were well into your gaming at that point. So you were spending a lot of time in the gaming. What about actual, outdoor sports too? Tell us a little bit about that and to what extent you participated and what relevance that had or connection that had to your gaming.
Yeah, sure. So, from a young age, I think it really again helped me spending a few of my younger years on the farm, kind of toughened me up a bit. And so by the time I moved over to Ohope, I was always a sporty kid. I'm not probably your typical, again, that stigma we talked about earlier. It's not probably what you envision when you think about a hardcore gamer. So I was always a big guy, always really sporty. I was pretty big into athletics in our region, and so I used to compete in our athletics tournaments. I broke a couple of school records coming up, for the high jump and the long jump. I think in my final senior year at high school, I won every single track and field event in the school in that 1 year.
Really?
So yeah, I just when you're 6'4" at 13 years old and you start putting on a bit of a mass, yeah.
Wow.
So in my younger years, I wasn't so coordinated. I tried football, soccer wasn't for me. I did a little bit of rugby, but again, wasn't exactly for me in that sense. Got into hockey, field hockey, when I was younger, and I played that for quite a while, and that was kind of my primary sport along with athletics as it came around. Until when I was sort of 13 years old, again, had that massive growth spurt, grew phenomenally, really, really young, haven't grown since. And so when the volleyball coach at Trident High School, and Trident High School is known for its volleyball team, we've got fantastic volleyball culture in the school. So when the coach saw this year 9 hanging off the outdoor basketball court hoops after I just dunked a basketball, he was just thinking, he basically ran out onto the basketball court and said, "Look, you're playing for us. End of story. It's not even a question."
Right.
And so I got into volleyball. We ended up doing really well. I think behind me here, you can see we went to nationals, and this was the medal that we got for the year. We got second in the country in nationals, and the school previous years to that, I got first place, and we've been national champions in that place. So sporting was really important to me all the way through school. Really enjoyed it, but it was always just something that I did secondary to. The passion was always in gaming.
I just can't get this image out of my head of you being, 13, 14-year-old, whatever it is, with a hockey stick, bouncing a hockey ball around the field. As a normal-sized kid at that time, I'd be scared seeing someone that size coming to the hockey stick.
My nickname in hockey was Albatross. That's what it was printed on my hockey jersey, because I just had the wingspan, and you add the hockey stick to that. And I'd be able to I was a defender, the sweeper and captain for our team in our senior year, and I'd be able to sit in the middle of the field and kind of look quite small, and they try and take a track around me, and I got about a 3 meter reach in one direction or a 3 meter reach in the other direction, and so it was pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, hockey's quite a dangerous sport, I reckon. My father used to play hockey, and I've had a couple of goes at it, but that ball hurts and you get whacked by the stick.
One of the most dangerous sports that I've played. I mean, I play with people who play volleyball for the first time, and they're worried about the ball hitting them in the face or something. And it's just like, you have no idea. The in reality of it, when you're for hockey players out there, PC, penalty corner, and you have to basically charge at the guy at the top of the circle about to hit that ball as fast and as high and as hard as he can. And you have to block it with your face, your shoulder, your chest, your legs, whatever it can. Nothing quite seems as psychotic as that. But we loved it.
Yeah, it just seemed, when you describe it like that, it seems like, why did they not have compulsory helmets or something? Because
professional games, they do. I mean, that ball is basically a small concrete bullet traveling at over 100 kilometers per hour at a goalie who's fully padded up. But the defenders, you got shin pads and a mouth guard if you're lucky.
Yeah, I know. It's just crazy, isn't it? So, okay, so school, sounds like you did well at school. So when you came to the end of school, kind of what was your plan at that point? What were you going to do?
So I didn't really, So I'll take you back a few years because this really stepped me up into where I got to where I was today. So after playing, I sort of played a lot of games and started into the game development aspect of things.
Okay, so when you came to end of your time at school, what were your plans at that point? What were you thinking you're going to do?
Yeah, so I guess to give you a little bit of context, we'll go back a couple of years. So I started playing games pretty heavily when I was sort of 11 or 12, got into the software development side of things. And so naturally in school, I went towards the computer subjects. Um, I Computer subjects again weren't super developed back in those days, and so I kind of ripped through those fairly quickly. If you're familiar with the NCEA system at schools, we've got sort of NCEA level 1, level 2, level 3. During my year 11 year, I managed to get enough credits at excellence level to sort of pass my level 1, level 2, and level 3 year all in year 11.
Wow.
And that contributed to why I could kind of decide to, I might stay home today because I didn't really have too much that I could do at school outside of that. During that time is when I started my first company. So I was about 15 years old when I started doing sort of contracting and freelancing for programming for various, or sort of starting off in the networking and security field. And I was basically doing ethical hacking or white hat hacking for various companies during the day instead of being at school. So that was kind of what I did a couple of days a week.
So you were this is all self-taught. You taught yourself.
Yeah, this is all just stuff that I learned through through making games. I learned Java. I was one of the youngest Java certified programmers in New Zealand at the time. I was probably, I think, 14 when I got the qualification for that, and then I sort of applied those skills, and I just had made contacts through the gaming space, and that's really where the name Arcadian. I was known as Arcadian in that realm. So I was in that ethical hacking space, started my first company, and I was doing that a lot of the time instead of coming to school. And full credit to the school for not just kicking me out, because by the time I turned sort of 16, my attendance was really, really bad. But I thought I was a baller, making thousands of dollars, doing little programming gigs, and I kind of already finished school. And one of the pivotal moments for me in my academic career was when one of the deputy principals came to my class when I was on my 16th birthday, and he knocked on the door, and he pulled me out of the class, and he said, "Here's your leaving certificate. See you later. 35% attendance isn't good enough," which is actually what it was at the time.
Wow.
It was shocked me because my mom had no idea. And so I was like, how am I going to explain to my mom that I've been kicked out of school? Like, this is horrible. And he said to me, when he gave me that leaving certificate, he said, "I'm really disappointed because I thought you were going to be our head boy. Like, I had so much faith and potential in what you could have done, and you've just chose to," and they had no idea what I was doing really at the time. They knew a little bit about I started my own business. And so he basically said, "Look, you need to make a choice whether you're going to come to school or you're going to run this business." And I agreed to make my attendance better. I negotiated my first real big deal with the principal of the school then, and I said, "Look, I'll do better, but I'm not going to be, your star attendance student." And he agreed, and so that carried on through my year 12 year. And at the end of year 12, they said, "Look, we went off to a leadership camp, and they said, we do want you to be our head boy, but if you're gonna do that, you need to be at school more often." And so that's when I had to make the choice on whether or not to sell my business or pass it off to someone else, and go down and continue with school, or pursue that career in that business 100%. And so at that stage, I decided to sell my business. So I sold my first business for about $100,000 US at the age of 17. Yeah, so it wasn't a bad little kickstart for me, but I chose to sort of continue at school and be that role model. And part of that was some of the opportunities coming up in my final school year. So I was invited over to the Microsoft Education Forum in Singapore in that year, and I went and sort of represented New Zealand and the student body in that space to learn around what we're doing around education and leadership. And that's really what sort of inspired me around the education sector, which is what took over after I left school. So I did that. I met a lot of contacts at Microsoft. I competed at one of the Microsoft Computing Championships in my final year at school as well as head boy. And I kind of just, built a lot of those connections until Microsoft offered me an internship with them over in Redmond, which was a huge opportunity for me. So I was like, great, I'm going to leave school, 18, move over to Redmond, start at Microsoft, like a dream career for someone in the IT space, especially, back in those days.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, though, I was the first ever candidate to be offered an internship who hadn't gone under tertiary education. So I had no
Oh,
formal
okay.
tertiary education requirements, and that was an issue for my visa. And so they had no procedures internally to support someone without tertiary education. And so unfortunately, that internship sort of fell through, which was a bit of a shame. And that kind of left me wondering, what do I do next, really?
Right.
I did a couple of papers earlier in my school year. I did some papers with Massey University in computer science, but I just
Yeah.
thought, not for me. This is stuff. The world moves so quickly, and that kind of gave me insight into the education world, how slowly it was moving, and I was really shocked that universities were teaching stuff that was almost about to be irrelevant or already dated in the technical world.
Right.
I applied for some extramural study through Stanford University, and this is just after I'd finished high school. So this is sort of 18 years old. I did a couple of papers with Stanford, and they were useful, but again, in that space of like having worked in the technology space and having had dealt with clients, and I really already had a lot of work experience in that area. The theoretical stuff that we were doing and the requirements of the course just didn't make sense to me, and so with the creative skills that I kind of picked up and being independent in my younger years, to me it just didn't make sense to go down that academic pathway. So at that
Right.
moment on, I chose to forego any tertiary study at all and just said I wanted to get out there and get into the real world. And that's when I started working at IC Central. IC Central is a certification provider company, and they basically worked with the likes of Microsoft and Adobe, Unity, Apple, Autodesk, all of the software giants. And their mandate was basically to help provide certifications to schools to help validate digital skills. And it was all industry-driven learning. So in the education world, there's a really big and it's a constant debate around, is what we're teaching linked up to industry? Are we preparing our students with the skills they need to work? And in my view, all of that conversation was being driven from the academic side. The academic side was saying, how do we meet the market? How do we meet the market?
Yeah.
And in the IT space, it got so bad, and it is still so bad, that the industry has said, we can't wait for you to provide decent candidates anymore. So they went out there and they created their own curriculum and their own frameworks and their own expectations and said, hey, this is the skills we need as the industry. This is what we're demanding. And they created certification programs so that individuals could validate their skills against that international framework.
Right.
And so you could, if you wanted to be a programmer, you could go get a Microsoft certified, programming certificate in Visual Basic or C, or whatever it might be that you wanted to do. You could go out there and get an Adobe certified professional certification in visual design or Photoshop or Illustrator. And it was just strictly, the entire ecosystem was driven by the fact that the academic sector weren't able to meet the throughput in terms of talent. And the tech sector was struggling in terms of trying to recruit people and employers. And that was something that I had just experienced myself. Going through the Massey and the university and the Stanford experience was like, yeah, these guys were teaching things that just didn't line up in my brain. And this is a company that is doing trying to remedy the exact problem I just experienced. And so from the ripe old age of 18 years old, I moved to Auckland and started working for IC Central.
Wow. And how long did you work there for?
Worked there for about 2 or 3 years, starting off in sort of tech support, customer service, sales, and worked there for quite a few years. And then I ended up having to take a break for medical reasons from that. And that kind of did change my career path a little bit. But yeah, 2 or 3 years with IC Central, which was really great for me.
So really, I mean, I imagine you would have been one of the youngest employees at that point in time, and you had had a wealth of experience prior to that most other people that you would have been working with probably hadn't had, I would imagine.
Yeah, I had, it was interesting. I did have firsthand experience. I was lucky enough to, in one of the conferences, I spent 10 hours on a plane or 15 hours on a plane from New Zealand to Singapore, sitting next to the founder of IC Central. And so if you've ever had a long first interview, that was it. so we had a really great conversation on that flight. And that's where I built that connection initially. And he sort of saw potential in me, which is why I was able to get such a great opportunity. But being young, especially in the education space, was really brutal. I went to meetings and met with teachers, and I was really trying to help them out in terms of like, helping them understand this issue. And I got laughed out of rooms, literally
Right.
people laughing in my face when they find out that you're 18 years old and you're trying to sell me something. Like, get out of here.
Yeah.
And so it was pretty tough, but a hardening experience, if anything
Yeah.
else.
I was going to say character building.
Yeah, that's the one.
Add that to your skill base, having thick skin.
Yeah, for
Okay,
sure.
so tell me what happened from there. So you touched on it. So you had a medical event. Can you elaborate more on that and what transpired?
Yeah, sure. So I guess all in all, really privileged childhood in my view from what I was able to learn. Even though we never had all the money in the world or anything else, and we were in a small town, I felt like my upbringing was invaluable to my perspective on the world. Thought I was pretty much on the top of the world working with IC Central, doing my stuff. And I was about 20, I was probably 21 years old at the time. And I went out to celebrate my 21st birthday in town. And whether or not I had a bit too much to drink or whatever it might have been, I ended up having a seizure in the street that night.
Wow.
And I don't really remember too much about it other than the ambulance sort of showing up. And I remember sort of being on the side of the curb, and it wasn't a great experience. I woke up the next morning in Auckland Metro Hospital, and one of the doctors came in and basically just said, really nonchalantly, I remember it very vividly. They walked in and said, "Hey, you had an episode last night. We've run some scans overnight while you've been unconscious, and you've got a lesion in your brain." And then she walked out.
Oh, wow. Really? Without elaborating any further? Just you got this lesion and that's it.
It was almost like she didn't even look me in the eye when she was saying it. She like walked in and checked the screens. Yeah, you've got this lesion in your brain. And then she left again. And I was it like hit me like a bombshell. And obviously all the worst situations go through your mind about what it could be. And I was desperate to learn more. Eventually I learned that I did have a brain tumor. And I consulted with one of the neurosurgeon or the neurosurgery team at Auckland University. At the Auckland Hospital, and they basically said, "You look, it's in a pretty bad place. We can't operate on it most likely, and so you've got probably about 8 months left of your life.
Wow.
Go and enjoy it."
That would have just How did you cope with that? What was your initial reaction to that?
I think it's too big of a thing to really have an initial reaction to. Initially,
Right.
I remember just not even grasping the situation straight away. And again, sort of living by myself in Auckland or flatting and really just being almost like a road warrior with IC Central and kind of being in that space. I was pretty shocked about it. So I kind of, I didn't tell anyone for the first little while, and I was just kind of like coming to grips with it, I guess.
So you didn't tell your mum, who was a nurse?
No, I didn't tell anyone. I didn't tell my family, didn't tell my boss, didn't tell anyone about it. I just kind of kept on life as usual for probably the next month or so, just processing it. And then eventually I came to the conclusion, I was like, I have to tell my family what's going on. Didn't tell my boss yet. So I called my mum, and there was no other experience in my life. And I don't think you can really fathom what it's like to have to tell your parent that you're going to die as a kid. And it's the last thing that you want as a parent, I'm guessing, is to be able to have to outlive your children. And so that was probably the hardest phone call that I've ever had in my life. And explain that to her. So that was really tough. That was really tough, and it's still tough to think about having to do that at this stage. So we that was the reality of it. And so I kind of was talking with a friend of mine, and after I made the sale of my company in school, I was kind of a little bit irresponsible with my money at the end of my high school years, and so I put it all away on a trust or in a term deposit that I couldn't touch. And so I was talking with a mate of mine in Auckland. I was like, let's just spend it. Let's just go on a world trip. Let's go out with a bang. Why not? And then I got a call from one of the neurosurgeons at Auckland Hospital, and he sort of said, "Look, we know that it's not good, but we can give you a chance. You can have the surgery. We can attempt to remove it, but it's a less than 5% chance of success. Like, you need to completely
Wow.
make this decision entirely by yourself. If you want to give it a go, we can give it a go. So my options were essentially have a surgery in 2 months or live for 7 or less or more.
And just to put that in context a little bit more, in terms of the surgery, if it didn't work, would that have meant immediate death, or what were the ramifications if it didn't work?
I'm not sure. I mean, it was almost as like, it was a 90 or 5% chance of success, as in being fully back to normal. I'm not sure what the breakdown was in terms of death versus brain dead versus loss of cognitive function. But the amount of forms that I had to sign to basically say that if anything goes wrong, it's completely my decision, made it pretty scary.
Yeah, it would have done. Wow, so that's a lot to take in at age 21. So you're having to deal with that.
Yeah.
Okay, talk us through that.
So yes, honestly, it didn't take me a whole lot of time to decide. I just thought, hey, what's the difference that the next 6 months are really going to make profoundly for me, in terms of like the legacy that I leave or anything else. And so I pretty much took it straight away and just said, let's lock it in, let's do it, let's get it done. And I guess the most vivid memory for me was being wheeled into the surgery room. Well, two things. One was before the fact. So again, I mentioned I'm a pretty big guy. And the nurse was doing her observations as we went in, and she said, have you experienced any unexpected or sudden weight loss recently? I said, no, everything's felt relatively normal. I felt good, everything else. There was no real side effects. And then she said, okay, what's your height? And I'm 195. And then she said, what's your weight? And I said, 105. And then I sat in the chair to do the weight. And she said, oh, you're actually 85. So
Really?
without even noticing, I'd lost, 20 kilos.
Wow, that's incredible.
So yeah, I must have looked like a stick or something at the time, but I hadn't noticed it at all personally. Like, I was so engaged. I mean, one of the ways that I got through that kind of period, because the 2 months coming up to the surgery was one of the moments I remember thinking to myself almost immediately, don't think about it, because it's one of those things that you can think yourself into a depression about. Like, I could have driven myself mad about, was it the right decision, back and forth. And so told my boss, I said, hey, I need 6 weeks off. I got a little surgery I need to do, to take care of.
Oh, wow.
And he said, well, tell me a little bit more about that. So I gave him the full situation, and he was really understanding in the situation. But I basically ended up, and he said, stop working from that day. He's like, no, until you're fully recovered from now, you're off, with fully paid leave. And so I had that I could, lean back on, which was incredibly generous of him. But those 2 months leading up to it, I fully engaged myself in gaming, and I just used that as a way to help deal with, process the issues, to help keep my mind occupied, to keep my mind healthy. And in terms of like well-being and my mental state, I sort of set myself a goal within the game, which was to become in the top. There's a certain tier in the game which they call Challenger, and that's the level at which you can basically start competing with all the the world-renowned professionals. It's the top 0.01% of players. Like, only 50 people in the region out of millions of players are in that challenger bracket. And I said, that's where I want to get to. If I'm going to do anything else before I leave this world, it's going to be to get to that's my arbitrary guiding star. And so for 2 months, I just grinded and progressed and got better. And I managed to achieve that status literally the day before my surgery. And so I was I was content with what I'd achieved. Went into the surgery, and I remember being wheeled down to the surgery corridor, and I was just thinking, like, man, and this is one of the first times I'd really let my mind regress back into thinking about the surgery. But I was thinking, this is a 5% chance of success. And I was like, that's like playing Russian roulette, but instead the revolver's a 20 chamber revolver, and only one of them's not loaded.
Yeah. That's not a good way to look at it.
But I was, and I mean, I'm glad that I only started thinking that way 30 seconds before being put under, because I can't imagine what state my mind would have been in if I had let myself dwell on it, for months at a time. And so that's when I went in. They put me under, and then I woke up. and that was the success. That was the minute I opened my eyes, I kind of knew that we made it, which was awesome.
And what did they say when you woke up? Did they know that it had been successful, or they had to wait and see before they were sure?
I think they knew that it had been somewhat successful. We did cognitive tests. I was in hospital for the next month doing cognitive stuff, all the way along from speaking to motor coordination and everything else. It was probably about a month or so before they knew it was a complete success, but it was definitely like the fact that I woke up for me was just, and I was cognizant, I guess, was the best feeling.
So are they on your Christmas list now, those surgeons?
It's funny, I get MRIs every year, and it goes off to the neurosurgeon to review the guy that did the surgery, and I've never heard from him since. We've never actually had a consult or anything. But it's funny. But yeah.
Amazing. And does that mean that you're totally clear? Is there a risk that it could grow back or come back in some form?
Yeah, they did a biopsy of the piece of the tumor when they took it out, and there is a chance that it can. It was a certain type of tumor that can occur anywhere in your body, so it can come back again. I get screened every year. I get MRI scans, and I do follow up through those systems to make sure. We are 8 years since the surgery, or just after 8 years. I had my 8-year anniversary on the 23rd of October, and to date, we're good.
Yeah. Well, that's a good feeling after that. So did that change you in any way? Does that change your perspective on life at all?
I think it did. I think, again, at the time, I don't think you can't appreciate what it does to you, but it did certainly change my outlook on a lot of different things. I mean, thinking about, at the time I was so focused on, I remember it's almost being jolted forward 10 years of your life. You at one stage, on one side of the surgery, you're this 21-year-old who thinks you're bulletproof, you're on top of the world. All the rest of my friends were in uni while I was out there earning money, doing things I was really passionate about. And on the other side, I kind of was reflecting and was like, man, I was really far away from doing anything truly meaningful.
Right.
And so if that was from the effect of the surgery, then it had a profound impact on my perspective. And it was at that stage I talked to my boss, who gave me the leave, and I said, look, this has been a fantastic experience, but time on earth is limited. It is finite, and I want to go and do something that I'm passionate about. And so thanks for the opportunity and being so supportive, and I wish you all the best. But I'm going to go do something crazy. And that's when I moved out of Auckland, and I started doing YouTube full time, and really decided to go 100% into gaming.
Wow. So where did you move to? And tell us a bit more about you going on YouTube full time.
Yeah, so at the time I was flatting with a friend of mine who I met through gaming, and so we played the same game, League of Legends. And he was doing animation at animation college at the time, and he was a really, really talented guy. And YouTube was kind of just starting to kick off. We'd done a few bits and pieces already, and we just decided, he put out a video initially, and it got 10,000 views on YouTube. And we were yeah, that is awesome, coming from a brand new, fresh channel. And I thought at that stage, this has really got potential. And I really loved the game, and I knew so much about the game, and there wasn't a lot of educational content. There was so many people playing League of Legends. To give you some perspective, this is 8 years later, and League of Legends hasn't really grown too massively in player numbers over the last few years, but there's 180 million concurrent players playing League of Legends this month.
Incredible.
If that was a country, that'd be the 9th largest country in the world.
Incredible.
Yeah, so it's a massive, massive game. And all these guys are trying to get better. All these people are trying to get better. And we think about how many schools we have educating people in a small country like New Zealand. Imagine there was no school for educating all of those players of that game. And so my sort of thinking at the time was, I've got an education experience now. I'm really good at this game. I'll make educational content and show people how to be better. And then my friend can do the animations and create cartoons, and we can sort of work on the creative side together. And so we decided to go for it. We packed up the house that we were flatting in, and we went over to, it was really good timing. My mother just decided to take a trip over to Europe. And so she sort of spent all her savings on going over to Europe to experience that. And so we house sat for her for about 8 months back in
Perfect.
Ohope. Yeah, so it was a good time. So we rocked up. We started doing YouTube. We started in, I think it was probably near the beginning of the year in March. And by the end of that year, we had grown from 0 to 300,000 subscribers on YouTube. We were
Incredible.
the fastest growing Facebook gaming brand in the country.
Yeah.
And this is the world has changed a lot since then, but this was in 2014 where, YouTube was much newer. There's only a handful of creators over 1 million subscribers. We had 27 million minutes watched in 1 month on the platform. So we were
Staggering.
bringing in views.
Yeah.
It was really, really good. So we were doing really, really great. And that opened up a lot of doors for us to work with Riot Games, who's the publisher of League of Legends. They flew us over to LA to participate in one of their creator labs. We met a whole lot of different creators who are now absolute titans in that space. And so if you're familiar with the Twitch space at all, or maybe someone viewing this will know, like the Pokemanes and the Valkyries or the Uber Dangers. These are all creators who create massive online content. We were there when it all started, and we were all part of the same, chat group in the community. So we did really well, but we probably made a young man's mistake, and we worked far too hard for far too long in a very short amount of time, and we just burnt out. So come the end of that year, we moved back to Auckland after my mum returned home, and we just said, hey, let's take a well-earned 4-week break.
Yeah.
But much like going to the gym, it's real hard to start back up again after you take a 4-week break. And so the creative juices were really, really exhausted, and we just weren't able to get back into it. And at that stage, I was starting to question. There wasn't a lot of money in YouTube those days. Like if we were running those numbers today, we would have been making hundreds of thousands of dollars in ad revenue. In those days, we were barely getting enough to get by, and so it wasn't by any means a financial venture. And so it's at that stage I thought, look, that was really fun. I really enjoyed it. I'm really glad I pursued this. But again, we're no closer to doing anything really meaningful in the world. So that's at that point I decided to call up my old boss again and say, hey, what are we doing with IC Central? What's the story with this? And they had just rebranded to a company named Xerio at the time. And he said, look, we're restructuring the business. We'd love to bring you on to try and rebuild the business in New Zealand as the country manager.
Wow.
Yeah. And so
how long were you at that stage?
So I was probably closing in on 24, 25.
Right.
No, probably younger than that, probably 23 or 24.
Right.
Yeah. So I thought long and hard about it, and I said, well, look, I'm going to need to get paid a lot more, and I'm going to need a house, and I'm going to need it furnished, and I'm going to need this, and he just said, done. Like I think I was doing really good work prior to my surgery, and so he was keen to get me back on board, and so that's when he took a massive punt on me to be the country manager for New Zealand and really run that ship in terms of getting the business running. And I said, yep, let's do it. And so
can I just push the pause there for a minute, because I want to put some perspective on this. So you'd started with the company when you were 18, and you were like answering phones and stuff like that initially, something like that, was it?
Yep. Tech support, answering phones.
And by the time you went to surgery, what were you doing?
So that was sales manager. So I just did sales in the Auckland region.
You did a bit of sales. So then you have your surgery, you go away and you come back, and next minute you're the New Zealand manager. I mean, that's not bad going.
It was pretty good. I mean, it was a small company, right? So it's not as if it's I eclipsed hundreds of employees. But one of the projects I was working on prior to give you some reasoning behind it was that we were running a pilot with the Ministry of Education, and we were working with Microsoft with 10 pilot schools around the country, helping them engage with certification and kind of integrating it with their curriculum. I was primarily in charge of that pilot program before I went into my surgery. Every one of those 10 schools I had, were really engaged. Our certification numbers were great. They were learning fantastic skills. We had some really great stories coming out of it. Since I had left and gone to YouTube, that program, as far as I could tell from a statistical point of view, has started to decline pretty significantly. And so that demonstrated, I guess, my value to the business, you know, in a more tangible way.
Yeah.
And so from then on, he said, "Look, we need that kind of leadership to let's run the boat. Let's see what we can do." And it was a great opportunity, so I took it.
And how long were you there?
I was there until about 6 weeks ago.
Oh wow! Okay, so that was going to be my next question. I just want to know where that fit in a relationship to where you are now.
Yep. So I took that on board. We ended up separating formally from the Australian business, and so we split the entities up to be a completely New Zealand run business. After a couple of years of successful trading, I ended up purchasing a controlling share of Xeria, which we then changed into NZIQ, which is the New Zealand Industry Qualifications. And from then, I was CEO, managing director, majority shareholder of NZIQ, and run that company ever since.
So So now that you've left there, does that mean that you've sold it? What's happened there with the ownership?
No, I mean, thankfully, we're in a really good situation. We're doing really good work nationally. So certification is still a big part of what we do, but it's not entirely core to what we do. A lot of the value that I feel like we bring as NZIQ is helping schools navigate this really difficult space and embracing technology in schools. So we've got a fantastic team who's able to take over for me. I'm just stepping back from a CEO role into a directorship role. So I'll still be helping direct the strategy. We have great strategic partners through tertiary institutes and schools across the country. And so I'm just kind of, it's my first step back and let the baby take its first steps.
And how are you feeling about that?
I'm a little apprehensive, but I'm quietly confident at the same time. I trust our systems, and I think that it'll continue to do well. And we're doing great things for our schools, and so it's still all good.
And so what was the motivation? What was the thing that really piqued your interest that you felt compelled to leave that role and take on this current role?
I never thought it would happen, to be honest. It came out of the blue, absolutely. But I guess, again, it attributes it back to that, how do we make meaningful impact? And so I've been, after leaving esports and after leaving gaming and coming back to the business, I kind of kept esports in my peripheral the whole time.
Yeah.
In 2015, the NZGC happened, which was the New Zealand Gaming Championships. It was the first premier esports event that existed in New Zealand, as far as my knowledge at the time. And being a fan of gaming, but I've sort of been in that space, they reached out to me to say, "Hey, do you want to host it? You're kind of a known personality in the space. Do you want to be part of the show?" And I had already started back at NZIQ at the time, and so I was like, "Yeah, sure, why not? I'll give it a shot." And that's where I met Duan, Mutu, and John, and Daniel Wrightson, the guys at Garage TV. That whole ecosystem is part of the NZESF, as I met them in 2015 at that event. And since then, I kind of stayed in touch with esports. It was kind of a personal hobby of mine or a passion, but I didn't chase it. I was focusing on my professional career with NZIQ and raising that business up. And so that's where it all sort of started. And then in 2020, NZESF was recognized as a sport, or as the NSO, the National Sporting Organization for Esports. That was a really great accomplishment that the team had pushed forward, and I was a great supporter of that. And then about 8 to 10 months passed, and not a whole lot had happened after that massive milestone. And John McRae, who's the vice president, acting president of the NZESF, reached out to me at the time, and he said, "Hey, Jonathan, do you want to? Would you consider joining the executive board for the NZESF?" And I said, "Absolutely. I want to know what's going on, because this is something that's really important for our youth, and we haven't been seeing a lot happening." And so I joined the executive board. I got a really good feel for what was going on and what the challenges were. And the number one priority item we had was to hire a new CEO. And so we had a job application sent out. We had it listed on Seek and stuff, and all the places. And I was looking through all of these CEO applications, and we had some big applicants. Successful business owners from large New Zealand corporations that would be very recognizable for you if I said the name, and lots and lots of interest. People from international sports federations, really successful guys. But esports is a really unique field, and reading through all of them, I was like, I was really afraid of hiring someone who was just going to be another traditional businessman in a world that they didn't really understand.
Right.
And I believed really strongly in the vision of the NZESF and the impacts that it could be having. We had very little player representation from a board level at that point. No one really knew what it was like to grit and grind as a player to sort of be in that space. And I had some personal experience in that. And so I sat down one night with my wife and I said, am I crazy? This is a really controversial idea. But what if I put my name forward? What if I stepped away from NZIQ and I put my name forward? And she's very supportive. She's like, if that's what you're passionate about, I think you should do it. And so I did. And I removed myself from the board from that stage, essentially, to let them make the decision. And I got a call saying, we'll take it. Yep, you're on.
Wow. I'm sure that was very unexpected for everyone, that's for sure.
It was unexpected for me because I knew the caliber of the people who were also applying for the role. And in my mind, I was almost the controversial pick because much younger, much less experience. I did have the gaming perspective, but I think that in terms of my track record, I had built, multiple companies, successful startups. I wasn't someone who was a delegator. You have those seasoned CEOs who are used to having departments to handle everything for them. Yeah. And I build everything myself, from the web design to the marketing to the PR. Just everything that I do is kind of I'd fought for. And so I think that kind of fire really probably suited better to the startup environment that we were walking into with the NZESF.
And so for you, though, you had the complication, though, that you had your existing business. So was that a bit of a struggle initially, the thought that you're going to have to sort of let go of that to some extent in order to take on this new challenge?
The thought was struggling initially, but it was something I definitely prepared for before I put my name forward. So I had succession planning and I talked to my other shareholders and we had a plan moving forward if it was the case. And now that it has happened, we're not. I'm doing a little bit of double work still at the moment, but I'm slowly loosening the grip. But it's been successful so far, yeah.
So now you're what, 20? Are you 28 years old? Was it?
I think so.
Depends
on who's on the room.
What's that, sorry?
Depends on who's in the room. Sometimes at the board meetings I'm 45.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've achieved an incredible amount in that short space of time. What do you think have been the keys to your success? What's been your secret ingredient, do you think?
It's really hard for me to truly and meaningfully put a pin in the exact attribute that I'd sort of consider to be my secret recipe or my secret ingredient. I think I touched on it earlier when one of the things that I have really respected the value of has been that sense of independence that I gained when I was in my younger years. Those years that I spent sort of by myself and just me and my mum, I think it's the only thing I can really think of that really gave me that extra perspective. And so there was that piece. I think my surgery, obviously, and going through that life experience, it really put the fragility of life into perspective for me and made me really question, what I was doing. I have friends who are incredibly intelligent, incredibly, successful, who have basically went through university, have been in a job, and they've been at that job ever since. Right. And in contrast, I've taken a lot of risks and changed directions many times. Yeah. And I think that confidence was kind of given to me through the understanding that your career is not everything, and life is so insignificant in a way that you just gotta try. And so I think a combination of those two things has really given me a unique perspective on what I'm able to achieve and the willingness to take risks and shifts like this to sort of have a successful business like NZIQ running, and being able to put it aside to start with the NZESF. That to me is probably one of the things that's given me my perspective.
Yeah. So for you though, sort of reflecting on everything that you've been through, what would you say to people out there that are wanting to go out there and be successful in their own way? What would you recommend to them or advise to them are sort of some of the key kind of, I guess, qualities that they should possess or skills that they need to develop in order for them to go out and be successful in their own right?
Oh, there's so many things that I could probably go through. And I reflect on so many of the learnings that I've sort of gone over the years and the things that have resonated with me. One of I'll give you a couple just sort of top line. I won't go into them, but one is
Yeah.
that you either win or you learn, and that's something I learned in that grind to get to the very top percent of players in League of Legends, but is so valuable across the rest of my life. Is that there is no losing, there is no failure unless you fail to learn the lesson.
Right.
And, and that's so important that, every single time you win, that's great. But every single time you lose, you need to evaluate why you lost. And if you cannot, and the only time you truly fail is if you cannot learn. You cannot learn from what went wrong if you can't reevaluate. And that should be constant in all things. I have conversations on the phone or negotiations on a daily basis. And as soon as I hang the phone up, I'm like, okay, what went well? What went wrong? What failed in that call? And seeking out your failures, I think is so important. And we're taught to be afraid of failure. And I hate that. When I have children, if I'm lucky enough to have children, I really want to instill in them that it's not win green good, bad fail red. It's it's that failure is this really important part, and that's actually probably the most important part of it. So that's one of the things that I think is really important. You either win or you learn.
And I like that. I'm pleased you brought that up because that was going to be one of my questions. Is have you had your own failures in life? And if you have, how have you seen them? So you've really already answered that for me. So you see that your failures is an important part of your growth.
The most critical part. It's the flashpoint at which the growth happens, in my opinion. Have I had failures? So many failures. Too many to list. And I look through, and it's funny actually. I'm reflecting on just this this conversation we've had now, and I talk about my attendance in school and how that was potentially viewed as a failure, because that's something you shouldn't be doing that. It's bad. But what I had learned, not from the time that I spent away from school, but from making that decision, was invaluable. And that's all of the things that I sort of look through my life, and I look at all the points at which I made mistakes, and I structure how those have changed me for the better. And every day I make mistakes. Every week I make mistakes. But I'm on a constantly learning journey. And I guess that touches into the second piece of valuable advice that I'll give anyone, is that the most valuable currency in the world is knowledge. And it sounds cliche, but you can have as much money in the world. You can have as many cars, as many nice things. You can have the best job. But there's only one thing, and in the current market, if you're following the financial situation around inflation and recessions or bubbles or whatever it is, knowledge is something that cannot be affected in the economic sector, and it scales infinitely. And so, I knowing that knowledge is the most important currency, anything that you learn can contribute to your life every single day, and it compounds every single day, is really important. And that's, I see failure as my source of knowledge.
Right. That's a brilliant way to look at it. And I think has been part of an issue in society where we don't embrace failure, or at least we don't see or don't encourage the identification of the value in learning from failure. As you say, if you fail but you don't learn from it, well, that's not good. But if you fail but at least learn from it, and then there's something good has actually come from it, and you can grow from that.
Yeah. And that's where, I think I probably learned that when I was 11 years old, sitting in my room trying to make games, and I had no one to teach me. There wasn't YouTube tutorials. There wasn't things I could look up. There wasn't books about it. I had to write a bit of code, compile it, run it, see it fail, and go, not quite. Cancel, retry. What if I change this? Try it, fail. Trial and error. And that was how I was forged. That's how my thinking and my critical thinking skills were created, was through that trial and error. And I think that desensitizing myself to that failure, and actually every time I failed, being like, great, I'm one step closer to success. That mindset, I think, is probably the closest I've ever gotten to really defining it. And so Thanks for the questions.
Yeah. So for you, your attitude towards failure, what do you put that down to? Why did you take that attitude where I think it's probably reasonable to say that in New Zealand society, often, it's frowned upon failing.
I didn't have a choice. It was the only way forward for me. Being in that environment with no direction and no other resources, the only way that I could learn or progress in what I was doing, which is my gaming and my game development, was just through failing. Like, I just had to trial and error it. And I remember in my year 12 or year 13 math exam at the end of the year, we had an algebra question at the very end of the exam. And it was, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was basically show these workings to figure out this algebra equation. And I had no idea how to answer it, but I basically it was, X is equal to whatever. And I just went through my calculator and I probably put through about 50, 60 permutations of what it could be until I really refined in on what that number might be. Yeah. And I put that through as my answer, and I got, yes, you got the answer correct, but there was no working, so you got it incorrect. But I was one of the only ones in the year to have actually come out with the correct answer. And it was just because I was willing to sit there and give it a try. And I think that's a big part to my computing successes. I often deal with people with various levels of experience on computers who are too afraid to click the button or go into this and see how it works. And I just dive in head first. And that's just how I've been. This is how I guess I raised myself.
Yeah. And okay, so have you got any other final tips? I'm just conscious we need to wrap this up, but anything else you'd like to suggest are other things that maybe people need to think about?
No, not particularly. I think that those are really we didn't really talk about esports very much, did we?
No, we can maybe talk about that in another one. I'm sure there's plenty we can talk about there, but this has been fantastic. I mean, in terms of talking to people like you, what I hope that we can achieve from this is to give other people inspiration, for them to learn from your journey, and for them to feel like, well, no disrespect, to Jonathan, but he's shown me the way, so I should be able to do something similar myself. So hopefully people can get value from this and go out and do their own thing and achieve their own success in whatever form that might take.
I hope so. And to those people, I think those are what we've talked about are two very valuable ways to go about it. Don't be afraid to take every opportunity. Our mantra at high school was Kia mana wanui, which is to be courageous. It's to be steadfast and strong in what you do. And I think that very seldomly in my life experience, even though it's been very short, and I'm not saying be reckless about this, but not hesitating to take opportunity when it arises, very seldomly works out against you. Be willing.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Jonathan. I really appreciate your time today. I know your time's precious, and you're a man that's doing a lot in a short space of time, so it's probably even more precious to you. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to having another interview at another time where maybe we can talk a bit more about esports.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime. Love to walk you through all the things that we're doing and share sort of the journey on that piece so far, but we are in the early days, and so I'm sure we'll have lots to share in the future.
All right. Sounds good. Well, thank you very much for that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Paul.